All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Have you ever stopped to wonder how a perfectly normal human opinion, like a social norm or just a cultural preference, somehow manages to elevate itself into an indisputable divine command? We're going to put on our devil's advocate hats today and do something a little different. We are going to reverse engineer perception itself. We aren't just looking at isolated historical events here, we're looking at a complete interconnected system of cognitive framing, drawn directly from a textual analysis that maps out a literal matrix of power.
Now, the natural objection, what a normal person might assume right out of the gate is, well, if a rule is religious, it obviously must be from God, right? That's the inherited interpretation. But what actually happens when we challenge that assumption? What happens if we reverse engineer the actual source of the command and follow the complete chain of information? How exactly does a human-made rule completely bypass our critical thinking to demand unquestioned obedience? Let's reconstruct this chain.
Section 1. Forming the Mind, Authority and Inheritance.
To really understand this matrix, we're not going to start with abstract theology. We're going to look at a stark reality in 1873 Egypt to completely challenge our standard assumptions. Look at the sheer scale of this gap. In 1873 Egypt, out of 90,000 primary students in civil education, only about 3,000 were girls. And the source points out that most of those 3,000 girls were actually from Christian families. Now, when we see a massive, glaring gap like this, the inherited interpretation immediately kicks in, right? We assume, oh, well, Muslim women simply chose their traditional roles based on their religion. The gap gets blamed directly on divine instruction.
But wait, let's reverse the perspective for a second. If an entire society tells a girl from the moment she's born that her isolation is God's will, that being in public is a sin, and that her lack of education is religiously mandated, is her agreement truly a free choice? Or is she just choosing from a highly restricted set of options presented to her as absolute divine truth? See, when you attribute a rule to God, you fundamentally change the human behavioral response. You literally stop asking, where's the evidence? And you immediately start asking, how can I avoid disobeying God?
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact chain reaction the source exposes. It's fascinating. It starts out as just a mere human idea. Over time, through sheer repetition, it becomes an inherited norm. That norm then gets codified into legislation. And finally, the last step, it transforms into an absolute, unquestionable authority. The freedom of choice wasn't taken away at the very end. Actually, scratch that, it was removed at the very beginning by systematically controlling the information itself.
Moving on to Section 2, Pharaoh's Matrix, Monopolizing Vision.
Let's deconstruct the exact Qur'anic architecture of this specific kind of authority. To do this, we have to look at Pharaoh, but not as some historical king in a dusty textbook, but as a complete system of cognitive framing. The source draws our attention to this specific verse in Ghafir 29. It translates to, I do not show you except what I see, and I do not guide you except to the path of right conduct. Notice how chillingly precise that is. The system doesn't just rely on physical force. It monopolizes vision itself. It tells people exactly what they are allowed to see, effectively defining reality for them and dictating the one and only acceptable path of guidance.
But how does a system actually pull that off? How do you achieve a monopoly over an entire population's perception? Well, it uses a very specific psychological mechanism outlined in the text called fastakhaffa. Basically, this means to make the masses take things lightly. It's a deliberate way to systematically strip away their critical thought and condition their minds so heavily that they never even think to ask for the underlying evidence. The crucial point here is found in the conclusion of this verse in Az-Zukhruf 54. It says, "So he made his people take things lightly, and they obeyed him. Indeed, they were a defiantly disobedient people." Now, why are they called a defiantly disobedient people? Because they weren't just helpless, ignorant victims. They actively permitted the authority to strip their agency. They allowed their own critical thinking to be bypassed. Their obedience in this moment wasn't forced at gunpoint. It was a willing submission to a manufactured reality. They completely accepted the cognitive framing.
Which brings us to Section 3, Al-Mutashabiha, Ambiguity of Meaning. So a natural question pops up. How exactly does a new human-made system bypass our critical thought to gain this unquestioned obedience in the first place? Like, what's the actual linguistic tool being used here? The source identifies this central tool as al-mutashabi, which is the exploitation of ambiguity. Basically, the system co-opts familiar religious terminology. It takes words you already deeply revere, words you've heard a million times in sacred texts, and it wears them almost like a skin.
When a new human rule is suddenly wrapped up in a familiar sacred word, your brain just goes, "Ah, I know this," and it totally redirects your attention away from the human origin of the rule.
Let's actually look at how this plays out in history. The source tracks terms that denote supreme, divine elevation, words like Al-Uluw, by attaching these divine-sounding words to entirely earthly institutions, like calling a political center the high port, or naming normal earthly academies the highest religious schools. The system conditions your mind. You literally get trained to treat human authority with the exact same unquestioning religious reverence that is normally reserved only for the divine.
And the source explicitly exposes this mechanism using this verse from Ali Imran 7. It mentions those who follow that of it which is ambiguous, seeking discord, and seeking an interpretation. It shows us that this ambiguity isn't just some linguistic accident. It's being intentionally targeted by those who want to construct interpretations that serve their own matrix of power. They're using the ambiguous to build a bridge straight between their human desires and absolute divine authority.
All right, let's jump to Section 4, Inheriting the Book versus Holding Fast.
Now, playing devil's advocate here, the ultimate objection someone might naturally throw out is, but wait a second, these systems and institutions possess the book. They study it constantly, so aren't they speaking the ultimate truth? Well, let's reverse that perspective using the source text itself. In Al-Araf 169, the text explicitly warns of successors who inherited the book, meaning they literally have it and study it, but they trade its truth for worldly systemic power, or as it says, the fleeting gains of this lower life. They compromise the actual truth for a temporary systemic advantage.
So, if they study the book, does their authority automatically equal divine truth? The text makes it incredibly explicitly clear, no. Simply inheriting the text or studying it does not magically prevent an authority from fabricating human laws, taking worldly gains, and then just attributing those human laws to God. Just because they hold the book definitely does not mean they represent it.
This brilliantly illustrates two entirely different mental models when it comes to interacting with knowledge. Look at the one side. This is merely inheriting religious identity to justify your own authority and power. Now look at the other. This is actively holding fast to the text's actual truth, which, by the way, often means using the text to question that very human authority. True holding fast is a disruption to the matrix, not a blind submission to it. Okay, finally, Section 5, Al-Qur'an, the historical timeline.
If this matrix we've been talking about is actually real, we should be able to map this exact, revealed Quranic system right onto the actual timeline of modern history. So let's see if the pattern holds up. The source establishes the concept of Akara from this verse in Al-Isra 6. This absolutely proves that this battle between human systemic power and individual liberation isn't just some isolated event stuck way back in the past. It's an ongoing cycle.
Al-Qur'an is essentially the continuous loop. It's the historical cycle where the matrix of power, corruption, and systemic elevation just repeats itself over and over. The mechanisms of religious framing and cognitive control get defeated or broken down for a while, only for the cycle of authority to predictably loop right back around in a newly adapted form.
Look at how perfectly this timeline reflects that exact cycle. Back in the 19th century, civil education begins to disrupt the old monopolies of knowledge. We saw that 1873 gap highlighting the intense grip of cognitive framing on women. But then, by 1919, public agency breaks that matrix. Women enter the public sphere. The 50s and 60s see this massive expansion in civil liberation. But then, exactly as the cycle predicts, the loop returns. The 1970s marks the Al-Qur'an.
The source analysis shows us that the events of the 1970s weren't just some sudden organic shift in personal piety. No, they were a deliberate systemic project. It was the literal return of Pharaoh's matrix. New gatekeepers emerged, and they used those inherited religious terms, al-mutashabi, to monopolize exactly what society was allowed to see again. They used religious framing to shrink the civil rights of the individual, all while presenting their brand new human legislation as the undeniable, unquestionable will of God.
We've seen exactly how the matrix operates today. It works by replacing the actual book with an inherited, carefully curated interpretation that is completely designed to ensure your obedience. It systematically strips your agency while making you feel like you're just being righteous. True freedom, as we've reverse-engineered it today, isn't just about picking an option from a menu someone handed to you. It's about knowing exactly who wrote the menu and where those options actually came from.
So, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to take away today. The very next time you are handed a rule, a social norm, or a law, and you're told it is an unquestionable divine command, what are you going to do?
Will you simply accept the reality they present to you? Will you allow the matrix to monopolize your vision? Or will you hold fast, ask to see the full chain of authority, and reverse engineer the truth for yourself? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.